Good afternoon and saludos a todos. Nice to see you all. Happy Hispanic Heritage Month. I would love to make some noise in this virtual chat, in this virtual room. Please share where you're from, one thing that you are doing or have done or plan to do to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. I want to say welcome. My name is Jennifer Garcia. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Latino Business Action Network, also referred to as LBAN. We are the premier organization empowering Latino businesses to scale. We collaborate with Stanford University to conduct research on Latino entrepreneurship, to facilitate a Latino entrepreneurship scaling program, and we are growing an ecosystem of Latino and Latina entrepreneurs to empower the ongoing and continuous growth. So for those of you that are new to LBAN, I welcome you to visit our website to learn more about us. If you are joining us for the first time, you are joining a webinar series that was launched earlier this year. This is the 5th session of a 6-part series where our goal was to design and deliver content that would be educational, that would be applicable, and that would be inspirational to your business growth and journey. So to all of our returning participants, I say welcome back. Yet again, you are carving out time to invest in yourself and to invest in your business, which is always time well spent. I also want to say thank you to all of you that have shared your feedback and your gratitude for this series. It really does validate that what we are doing is relevant and it is meaningful. And from a very personal perspective, I love hearing all of your stories. So thank you for sharing that feedback. As I think of the impact that LBAN is having through this webinar series, we currently have over 950 registrants from across the country. It really is exciting to see that we are connecting with businesses who are primarily outside of the LBAN ecosystem. And this is important. It's important because all of you need access. You need access to resources, you need access to education, to capital, and to networks. And I'm grateful that this series is playing a role in bringing you this access. This six-part webinar series is supported by Bank of America, and because of their support, they too are playing a role in bringing access to Latino-owned businesses. So I just want to take a brief moment and play a short clip that highlights one story of Bank of America's impact.
I love to run. I love to hear the sound when I'm running on the gravel. Long distance running is about consistency. Business is the same thing. There are times where it's a grind. It's difficult. You figure out what you're going to do and work through it. My name is Oscar Zavaleta. I'm the principal for the Montes Group. We are a construction management company, so we specialize in transportation projects, very large infrastructure. So I immigrated from El Salvador, and it was tough not knowing the language. I came from a small town up in the mountains to one of the mega cities of the world, right? So when I was in high school, I had a great teacher, Jaime Escalante. He was one of the most influential people that I met in my life. Being an immigrant himself, knowing his story, how hard he had to work when he got here, that always stuck with me. In the construction industry, 75% of the workers are Latinos or minorities, but about 2% of the managers are Latinos. The ratio is incredible. I just knew that I wanted to be the person that made the decisions. And then after that, there was no looking back. I think I realized early on that I needed financing. I just didn't know quite the best way to go about it. Had the opportunity to meet Landon with the small business division of Bank of America. And we both worked in construction when we were young. And I think that was an immediate point of connection. I just felt he spoke my language.
It's my job to make sure that Oscar has a point of contact within the bank that he could rely on in order to help build and grow his business. I've even gone as far as going to Oscar's house to help him set up a remote deposit online.
Without Bank of America, the growth of our company would have been difficult. Our goal is to scale our company. We're expanding, and in able to do that, we are going to need a partner. The way I look at it is Bank of America is one of my partners. Being a small business, It's very challenging. But now, as we're going along, we're starting helping other small businesses to figure out how to increase that representation so that they're not faced with some of the things I was faced. I support organizations that make education a primary concern. That's what lifts communities like ours. I can't believe I'm actually got to this point. I don't really think I'm very smart, but I definitely think I'm very determined. That I tell myself, when I get up every morning, it's like, why not me? If I can do it, you can definitely do it.
What an incredible story, one certainly of inspiration, but one where you probably can connect and relate to some degree of what was shared there. Stories, as you can tell, is the theme of today's discussion. I want to say that for us as a country to make a meaningful impact on the economic and wealth gap for Latinos, we need all players in the game. We need everyone to work together to link arms. And I've had the opportunity and the pleasure of working closely with Bank of America and the team there. And I gather such authenticity, such intentionality in their approach to serving their clients, but also their role in closing the economic gap. Allow me to introduce to you Raquel Gonzalez. She is a phenomenal business leader, the Silicon Valley Market President of Bank of America. And she is acutely aware of the challenges that Latino entrepreneurs face. And as I will say, she and her team are in the game. They are doing their role and really working to close this gap. So without further ado, let me welcome Raquel to the stage. Hi, Raquel, how are you?
I am doing well, Jennifer. Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with all of you. And what a great story of Mr. Zabaleta and his success. Every time I see it, I am just so inspired. And, when he talks about, I just knew that I wanted to be the person to make that decisions. Like, who can't relate to that, that desire, right, to be successful and to be someone who can make a difference. So Jennifer, thank you. We are so proud of our partnership with LBAN and the whole entire team. And we share the same commitment to helping Latino and Latina entrepreneurs grow their business. Now, as Jennifer mentioned, today's session is going to focus on storytelling. I personally have had the opportunity to experience this same session with Holly and with Anne Marie. And it is just so powerful and compelling to be able to articulate our story, your own story, in an effective way. It is how we communicate and how we can develop deeper relationships with others, right? And every year here at Bank of America, I just want to share with all of you, we publish a Hispanic Business Owner Spotlight. And the study is part of just our ongoing research in terms of being able to understand the goals, the challenges, and everyday realities of small business owners, in this case, specifically Latino business owners. And this year's Spotlight, which was just published a few weeks ago, we surveyed 1,000 small business owners across the country. 81% of them told us that they expect their revenue to increase. And, even though the current environment has brought so many different challenges, and what's really great is to see that business owners remain optimistic and they're really focused on continuing to become more and more resilient. So how you can tell your story and the impact that you're making positively, just like Mr. Zabaleta did, it really can impact every aspect of your business. I know today's session is going to be really valuable, and I hope that at the very least, you'll take away a few action items that are going to help you become even more effective at what you do and really take your business to the next level. So I hope you find it as useful as I did when I first went through the session with Holly and Anne Marie. And please enjoy today's session. Back to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Raquel, and thank you to your entire team at Bank of America for supporting this webinar series. All right, you who are listening on this call, on this webinar, you are 62 million strong here in the United States. We are the fastest growing segment, business segment in the country. And each of you have a unique and powerful story. Our goal today is to bring that story to life and to amplify that story. So I'm excited, as Raquel mentioned, to bring to you two experts, Anne-Marie Honingtail and Holly Amaya from Story Imprinting. Welcome, both of you. And
Hello.
I will pass the stage to you.
Thank you very much for having us. We're thrilled to be here. And thank you, Raquel, so much for mentioning our previous work with Bank of America. Today, we're going to be talking about the social science and neuroscience of storytelling and why you should care and why it matters so much and why we believe it is the most powerful, underutilized tool of influence. And it is much easier to leverage anything regarding revenue, whether it's asking for funding or developing or doing business development, when you actually use storytelling. My own background is in business development. And so I've been using storytelling, have helped people build multi-million-dollar books of business for many years now. And I want you to understand that your story belongs to you, you own it, and you need to understand how to craft it and leverage it to its best and highest use. We want this to be an extremely didactic experience. Holly is going to be paying very close attention to the chats, doing our very best. You're a very large group.
You're very active. We like it.
But we like it. And we've also had very large groups in the past of 1,000 or more. So we will do the best we can to answer your questions in real time. And Holly will be interrupting you. But with no further ado, let's jump right in and start with the first slide. So I'm not sure who's controlling the slides, but let's see if we can get them moving. I am not controlling the slides, so just so you all know. So we're just waiting here for a second. While we wait, I'm going to dive in because here we go. Oops, just kidding. Let's start again. When you watch that video that was presented by Bank of America, what you will notice is that story is what we refer to as an origin story. You should all have your own origin story. And your origin story is, yes, about your business, for sure. It is also about where you came from and how you began. I came from a culture of poverty. My mother grew up on a sugarcane plantation in Hawaii, and that is part of my origin story. That is the beginning of all things. That is what informed how I moved through the world and became an entrepreneur. So I want you to be thinking about your own family of origin and your own sort of transformation story. What we want you to know is there is no society or culture in the world that does not exist inside of story. Storytelling is how we make sense of the world. Storytelling is how we come together. It's how we build trust. It's how we influence people. You right now, if you turn on any news station, and it doesn't matter which one you listen to, and no one here is judging you, regardless of your choice, you hear the word at some point in time controlling the narrative. There is a very old idea. He who tells the story rules the world. That is the power of storytelling. There are now sort of, chief storytelling officers in organizations, because we understand that storytelling isn't just something that's trendy or interesting, that it has science behind it, and we want you to leverage it. Let's move to the next slide, please. There is nothing that storytelling does not touch. Think of history, think of memory, experience, culture, identity. All of it is steeped in story. We also want you to be the hyper-conscientious story listeners and consumers. History is generally told by the victors. So many stories are silenced. And we think it's really important to sort of point that out. We want more equity, more voices, more diversity when it comes to storytelling. And fortunately, now there's a lot more democratization of access. Now we have many more people able to tell their stories simply because we have the internet, frankly. Think about religion. Why do you suppose storytelling is such a powerful tool inside of religion? No major religion doesn't use storytelling as its primary form of communication. If you have some thoughts about that, please drop them in the chat. Holly, do you want to add anything to this?
I was just saying, as we go back to family and origin story, think about sort of how stories are handed down in your own family, right? I mean, I know in my family, and Marie, certainly, I know you and I have talked about this with your mother in Hawaii, talking story. You don't go to someone's house to get together. You go to talk story. Every family tradition, every bit of my family history that has been passed down has been given to me through oral storytelling. And I am convinced that all of you on this call share that. That's part of this cultural experience, right? Your family stories are passed down. So I think we want you to think really expansively about storytelling, okay? Both in your own life and when it comes to your business. My background is in journalism. I'm also a lawyer, but I've done public relations and communications for years. And historically, storytelling was sort of viewed within a business context as sort of the role, the purview of a marketing department, right? No, we want you to think really expansively about how storytelling can inform your business development, your recruitment of employees, your retention of those employees, particularly during this sort of weird virtual hybrid environment that we are all still living in. So as we move through the rest of the content, we want you to really broaden your horizons on sort of what storytelling can mean for you and for your business goals. We can move to the next slide.
Say storytelling is the primary tool of preservation for culture, identity, and history. That is how we actually preserve and maintain the integrity of those things. It's through the vehicle of storytelling. Holly sort of touched on all of these things. I want you to see storytelling as part of your everyday business experience. It certainly is of ours. I launched my first company in 2009. Everybody who remembers 2009 and we're business in 2009, please say so in the chat if you survived that. It was the kind of time where, you know, the economy was terrible. The news would say this is the worst economy in history. I would go and get a glass of wine and come back and they were like, girl, it's worse than when you left. It was terrible. And now Holly and I launched our business in the midst of a global pandemic. And really, we use storytelling as the primary driver to sustain ourselves, to keep moving forward. We would not be here but for the power of storytelling. We would not have clients like Bank of America but for the power of storytelling. So we want you to look at these categories and think about storytelling in all of these ways. It's not a singular device that sits on your website in your About section. It is something you are utilizing as a communication tool every day to move people. Please move to the next slide. We want to jump right into the idea of influence. If you look at this sort of metric, what you'll notice is there are three things that are required to move people. Most of us think, we're going to really focus on logic and reasoning. We want to make sure people have lots and lots of information. And that's the thing that's going to influence people. Now, we all know personally from direct influence or direct experience that this just isn't true. We all have, maybe you don't, but most of us have somebody in our family that's a little crazy. Mm-hmm. If you do, say yes in the comments. And if you don't, that person might be you. Who's to say? But here's what happens. You go to a family dinner, they say something outrageous, and you think the way to change their mind is through what? Information. You're going to give them a statistic or a study and hope that that's going to somehow change their mind. But here's what I want you to understand that's incredibly important. No one wants to be convinced. We all want to be understood. That's what we actually want. And what storytelling does is it taps into that middle piece, pathos, emotions and beliefs. And in that way, it builds what is referred to as habitual trust, the thing that is required to actually influence outcomes and behavior, the thing that is required to sort of get more revenue in business development, to raise more money through funders. That's the piece that's going to be more important. We've worked with lots of startups, and we are here to tell you that funders will tell you, listen, the technology changes, the model changes. You know what doesn't change? The people and their capacity to convince me and tell a powerful story that I am willing to buy. That's the thing that's most important. Let's move to the next slide.
There's a great question that popped up in the chat. What should you not include in a story? We will get to that. I just want you to know that we're not ignoring it. We will focus extensively on the how, and we will address that question.
Yeah, let me just sort of stop and say one thing about that. I think you can tell incredibly vulnerable, and you should, important things in story. You shouldn't tell things that are not advancing the story. I'll give you a quick, if you're talking about, we have, I've sat through many, many presentations, and people will say, we have this many offices in this many cities. Probably nobody cares. The only reason they would care is if it has something directly to do with access to their situation. But you have to make sure that all of the details you're sharing are relevant, that they advance the story, and also don't share a story that's manipulative. Tell a story that's vulnerable and authentic to you. People can tell instantly. They can sniff it out when something doesn't feel authentic and real to them. In addition to understanding the power of influence that storytelling has, you should know that when you go and do a sales pitch, when you go and ask for money, that storytelling is remembered 22 times more than facts alone. And if you haven't, we highly recommend Jennifer Aaker's book, The Butterfly Effect, which is a book about marketing. But this tells you just how powerful storytelling is. When you aren't using storytelling, I want you to think about this. You're actually working against rather than with human nature. So it serves you to always be thinking about what's the important story I'm going to tell in this particular meeting with this particular individual on this particular stage, on this panel. What story do I need to communicate to move people? Next slide, please. So there's some things that go on with the brain. If you are not convinced about the social science, you should be very moved by the neuroscience. Here is what happens when we're just communicating a fact pattern. All that's happening is I'm speaking and you're comprehending. Now, a lot of you might think, that sounds pretty good to me. I'd like people to understand what I'm saying to them and comprehend it and take it in. It is good. However, it's not enough to actually impact influence. Influence doesn't happen just through comprehension, merely by reporting facts. It doesn't work. We've had the pleasure of working with climate scientists, and I'm here to tell you, they have a whole lot of data and a whole lot of facts, and it doesn't necessarily always move people to change behavior. It's the story of one fisherman in Louisiana who, for the first time in 8 generations, isn't able to feed his family due to global warming. It's the story of one polar bear mother and her cub who is starving because of the warming of the environment. It's the singular that makes something universal. That's what we need to tap into. Storytelling makes people say, oh, you're a duck, I'm a duck, I'm going to follow you. It's the imprinting process that occurs. It can't happen if you're just delivering information. When you're thinking about your sales pitches, your business development consultations, are they filled with fact patterns, with no narrative structure? Ask yourself that question honestly. Interrogate every deck, every meeting plan, and look to see whether you have a strong narrative arc that's going to carry you. If you don't, you're working harder than you have to. Now, look what happens to the brain when we tell a story. Move to the next slide, please. Now we have 6 areas of the brain engaged. Pretty impressive. We went from 2 to 6. And critically, memory and emotion is connected to that. Why do we care? Because that's critical to influence. So again, what we're talking about here isn't just what's on trend in marketing. What we're talking about here isn't what I think or what Holly thinks. That's not what's critical. This is how humans function. This is what it means. To be a human being is to be a storytelling animal. And when you understand that, it radically changes the way you function in your business, and it radically changes the way you make contact with people. Holly, do you have anything to share about that?
No, I think I need to move to the next slide.
Do we have any questions we need to get answered?
No.
Let's move to the next slide, please. So in addition to Ocker's work, please notice this from the London School of Business. When you're using statistics alone, you have a retention rate of 5 to 10%, which is pretty miserable on its whole. Now, look what happens when you add stories to those visuals. Now you've clicked up to 25 to 30%. If you just use story and nothing else, you're at 65 to 70% retention rate. You want to be memorable when you move out, when you leave the room. What I always tell people is, listen, when you leave the room, when you leave a company, when you leave an organization, when you leave this planet, all that remains are the stories that are left behind. That is what will define you. That is what people will say about you. If you aren't consciously creating that and you aren't clear about that, you're missing so many opportunities. I have been a part of many, many, many sales meetings, and I will tell you, when people walk out, they don't quote how many offices, what size of the book. They don't quote any of that. They tell the story that some guy or woman told about a particular client or about their kid or whatever it was. That's what they hold on to. So you need to make sure in your own sort of business development design, in your own presentation design, that storytelling is always the heartbeat. It's always the heartbeat. The facts are important. It's not that you're not going to address them. It's that you're not going to let them stand on their own. You're going to make sure that there's a narrative structure always. Holly, do you have anything to add to this? Is there anything else you want to say about this?
I think that, frequently when our clients, when we start working with companies, particularly early stage companies, they'll say, we feel like we need to hire a marketing firm to help us get to these stories. And I just want to put that out there for us each to sort of weigh in on, because, listen, I'm somebody that I've told other people's stories my entire life, right? And both as a journalist and as a paid consultant. I think that there is a time for consultants to help with this sort of thing, certainly. But you as the business owner, as the entrepreneur, must do the foundational work first. And we will leave you after this presentation with a list of prompts to sort of get you thinking about how to access these stories. But going back to the wonderful video we saw before the presentation began, we got an origin story. We heard from Oscar about a person who changed him. He talked about a teacher, just in one sentence, right? But you could see that. And it told you a lot about him, his relationship with that teacher, and how it shaped the rest of his entrepreneurial journey. And he also talked about things that he had overcome and his vision for the future. What I loved about that story is that it was very authentic. It was very honest. It didn't seem particularly scripted, even though, of course, it's a video, so we know there's production value involved. But he had clearly done the work of figuring out, how did I become, how did I get here, right? Like, how did I, what started my entrepreneurial journey? And it wasn't just that, I wanted to own my own business. Why? As a journalist, I will tell you the best questions in my arsenal always were why and how. And I would also say, tell me more about that. So when you are doing this process yourself, when you are taking the tools that you learned today to apply them to your own business and your own life, I want you to ask yourself those questions like a 5-year-old. Anybody have kids here? All they ask is why, right? So that's a great way of just interrogating your own story and getting those details, because I might not remember what Oscar does or at what stage he is in the life cycle of his business, but I'm going to remember that teacher, and I'm going to remember him talking about his relationship with his banker, because it was all very authentic and vulnerable. We will get into that more as we move through the content. Anne Marie, anything to add to that?
Just referencing that video again, the detail, here's the difference, and we're going to go over this. Maybe I should have waited, but the difference between showing and telling. Instead of the video saying, Bank of America is a high-touch bank, that's telling. But what did they do instead? They said, I remember going to Oscar's house and helping him with a remote deposit. That is high touch, which without saying that we are high touch.
Yes.
The difference is you have humans connecting with humans, and you're talking about a specific situation, which makes the singular universe. Now we can all identify with it. If you're simply saying things like, I'm passionate about,
that tells us nothing.
That tells us nothing. This is nothing to you. When I used to do nothing but business development, before I was really focused on storytelling training, and I would go to networking events, and people would say, well, I would ask people what they did. I would never start with what I did. I would ask them tons and tons of questions about what they did and want to learn more. And inevitably, here's what I would do. Is once they sort of had an opening, they would say, oh, what do you do? And I would say, I help people like you make more money. And then I would tell them a story about a client that was much like them, much more powerful than telling them literally my title, literally what I do. Share it through a narrative lens. Let's move to the next slide. So if you haven't, we highly recommend watching Paul Zach's TED Talk. He also has a book called The Moral Molecule. This, for me, was some of the most transformational work that cracked my whole world open. Before I understood anything about the neuroscience of storytelling, and before I had any context for it or knew it even existed, I was using storytelling to teach people how to sell, how to build a book of business, how to increase revenue, how to deliver presentations. I was doing that because intuitively I just understood it worked. I didn't understand why it worked until I stumbled across Paul Zach's work. Paul Zach looks at oxytocin. Do you all remember oxytocin and what it is and when we release it? Does anybody have any idea? If you do, you can drop it in the chat. If you remember going back to, high school or college biology, when do we release oxytocin? Well, I'll tell you one of the reasons is when you fall in love. Now, I'm going to say of all the, 800 or 900 people here, I'd like to believe we've all been in love once, at least, right? We've all been in love. I hope you're still in love. I hope somebody's loving you up right now. And here's what happens in those early stages of falling in love. Do you remember what that's like? Like, everything is gorgeous. You love everything about this person. They cannot do anything wrong. You love the way they eat their cheese and lose their keys. They are perfection for 18 months. And then your body stops producing oxytocin. Now, this is fascinating. I also recommend you read Sapiens, which also talks about the bonding of storytelling and what it causes. And why is this fascinating? We also produce oxytocin when we breastfeed. Why? To remind you, you love this child and this is hard, but you want to keep doing it. Oxytocin is critical to human bonding. It's critical to continuing the human race. And it is released when we share stories. That is pretty extraordinary. This thing that is critical to human survival is also released when we tell a story. How do we know that? Well, we know that because Paul Zach did some very interesting work. He wanted to see if storytelling made people more compassionate, more generous, and more collaborative. And here's how he did it. He isolated oxytocin. He took people's blood. He showed people a video of sort of this generalized kind of video to ask people to give to St. Jude's Children's Hospital. Very compelling, sort of organization. Childhood cancer. What could be more compelling than that? The first video had very little storytelling in it. And what he found was the oxytocin levels were very low. And guess what? After watching the video, there were very few people writing checks, and the checks they did write were not very big. Then they were very careful to construct a very powerful story about one father and one son. Remember, the specific makes things universal. That's what moves us. That's what creates the influence. Now, here's the extraordinary thing. The oxytocin levels went way, way, way up. And the higher the oxytocin levels, the higher the check they wrote. I'm going to say that one more time because it's pretty extraordinary. The higher the oxytocin levels, the higher the check they wrote. Yesterday, we had a call from a client in Silicon Valley at a startup. She previously worked at Uber, another client of ours, and had brought us in because of the work we did at Uber. And she had said, she is now the CEO of this startup in Silicon Valley. And she said, I literally got a call yesterday from a story I told in that class that we were in. And people still remember me, not for what I did, but for that story that I told at Uber. And I share that with you today because that is that memory piece. That is that contact piece. That is the piece that creates humanity. That's how we make human connection and sustain it. Have you all been in a sales and business development class? I know I have in my life, where they say things like, you need to just get out there. And you're like, okay, let me write that down. Get out there. And they're like, you need to make people like you. You're like, make people like you. They're like, business development is about trust. But you know what they never do? They never tell you how to actually build trust. They never tell you that it requires some kind of contact, that you have the capacity to accelerate trust when you actually share stories. And that's the heartbeat of it. You can do all of these other things. Please throw away all these phrases like, what keeps you awake at night?
What's your pain point?
What's your pain point? These are really sort of canned kind of sales phrases that actually don't build trust. They feel artificial. They feel manufactured. They don't feel like your language because they're not. They're meant in this one size fits all kind of way. And we really encourage you to find your own voice and for you to be able to articulate your story. The world needs your story, but you have to have the courage to actually shape it and share it. Let's move to the next slide, please. So in another piece of neuroscience by Yuri Hassan out of Princeton University, you may also watch his TED Talk. I'm going to be very frank. It's a little more dense, not as digestible as Paul Zach's, but he talks about the only time that a listener and a speaker's brains are synchronized is during storytelling. Again, think about that for a minute. This does not occur just when we're exchanging fact pattern or pleasantries. It only occurs during story. So again, we are wired for story. When you're trying to do other things, then what you're doing is you're working against story. And we should mention, we work, Holly's a former attorney. We work with attorneys on closing arguments. We work with attorneys in all kinds of capacities. We work with entrepreneurs and startups, and we work with, accountants. And I can tell you there is no place that storytelling doesn't exist. No place. It doesn't matter if it's at the C-suite level. It doesn't matter if it's business development or recruiting. There's always this space for which when you insert this tool, everything is accelerated. Let's move to the next slide, please. So we've kind of talked about all of these things and why it's so critical. Why we spend the time on this is we want you to understand it. You shouldn't take our word for it. You have the right to the education of understanding why storytelling works. I can tell you that it works, and then we can just give you the information. But once you break it down and understand it, you're better at using it. You're better at accepting why it works so well. Years and years ago, I worked for a fabulous man named Alex DeLuna. And my son is now about to turn 25 in December. And at the time, Jackson was really, really young. And Alex was one of these guys who was impeccably dressed. He was very serious. Everything was perfect. He had no children, which is important. And we had a meeting. And normally I always had childcare for both my children, but I was a single mom. And in this particular case, I had childcare for my younger son, but not my older one who got out early that day. Now, all of you probably have an experience where you've had to take your child to work when you were not intending to. If you've had that experience, please say so in the chat if you feel me.
Are you talking about the last 18 months or?
The last 18 months.
Okay,
always.
cool.
And I will tell you, Jackson was the kind of kid who was always in constant motion. He was always a mess. He was always outside getting dirty. He was not someone who was still. He was not someone who was easy. And he was young, right? So I take him into the office and I have this 45-minute meeting with Alex, and I sit Jackson down and I say, Jackson, I need you to sit here and I need you to be very good for just this 45 minutes. And like any quality parent, of course, I bribed him. I'm like, and afterwards, I'll buy you a car, whatever you need. Just, I need you to just for this period of time, be still. Here's my computer. Here's some paper. I'm going to be right out. And when we're done, we can go and do whatever. Okay, he says. And as I turn around to go meet Alex, I have this yellow legal pad. I'm about to walk towards his house. Alex walks towards me and he goes, well, hello, who is this? And he looks up at Alex and he says, my name is Jackson. I'm Anne Marie's son, and I have to be quiet and do nothing while she's in a meeting. And Alex shakes his hand and he says, no, no, no. I invite you to join us for this meeting, please. And of course, I'm like horrified because I know that Jackson cannot behave in a meeting. And I'm like, oh, no, 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 no. Let him be here. It'll be fine. It'll all be fine. He goes, oh, no, no, I insist. And so he invites Jackson in and we're walking behind Alex. And I do what every parent does in this circumstance. I look at Jackson and I'm like, you better be good. I'm talking with my face when you're not using words, and I'm hoping that he actually behaves. And we sit down and Alex does this extraordinary thing. He says, do you know why you're here today, young man? And Jackson says, no. And he says, because your mom is one of the most brilliant people I have ever met. And today you get the opportunity to see that. And I wanted you to be in this meeting today because you're never going to forget this. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. Now, if you're a single parent, you know exactly what that felt like. If you're any parent, if you want to do something for any parent, single or otherwise, make them look good in front of their kid. My son's going to be 25. He still remembers that meeting. And I still remember that meeting. And you want to know what? That built more loyalty between Alex and I than anything else he could have done for me. Because you know what he was doing? He was including me. Even though I had a child, even though I didn't have childcare, it didn't diminish my contribution. He made sure that I was included and Jackson was included. All of the things that you see here, Alex achieved. I have never forgotten that. And 15 years later, I'm still telling that story. So think about how powerful you are. Every single one of you. You have the power to be the story that transforms someone. You have that power. So wield it, exert it. Let's move on to the next slide. Holly, do you have anything to add?
No, we just something in the chat that I wanted to highlight. Someone says that she had to take her daughter to a networking event and she snuck in the corner and sat while I said hello to the potential customer I was hoping to meet. I felt so bad that night. And I totally see you. I've 100% been there. I've got 2 young kids myself. And my joke was really not a joke about the last 18 months. My kids have been present in lots of meetings without, again, sort of my judgment or better or wishes. But I think that, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but this idea of vulnerability, I think, especially during the pandemic, the volume's really turned up on that. I think there's this increasing recognition. Certainly, we're seeing it both with individual clients and with companies we work with, that you are not simply, a professional. You are a holistic person. There's a personal side of your life and a professional side of your life. And for the last year and a half, everyone's sort of been invited into your home for probably a large part of your day as you do things virtually. And so I do think there's this greater appetite and I would say yearning for in business development, both with clients and with if you're a vendor and then prospective clients, to really see to see the person who's on the Zoom screen or on the computer screen as that whole holistic person that they are. So thank you for sharing that story and know that you're not alone with that. And also in the chat, there's a reference to our story prompts document, which we'll talk about a little bit in greater detail later.
And I'm going to let Holly talk about the dark side of storytelling in just a minute, but I do just want to share this. In the midst of the pandemic, my mother was actually dying at home. She lived with me, and we were still conducting business. And what that meant was my mother was both dying downstairs and I was conducting business in my office on Zoom. And I thought a lot about how that could go. And I could have not shown up for meetings and let my business partner, Holly, take all the meetings, which she was happy to do. Or I could have just been really honest. And so I would begin meetings something like this. Hey, thank you so much for meeting us today. We are pleased to be with you. I also just wanted to let you know my mother's currently dying downstairs, and I may be torn away at any moment. So please forgive me if I have to leave. Holly will take over the meeting from there. And I thank you in advance for understanding. And we would just move on. There was never a time that I didn't get an email thanking me for that. Never. People thanked me because they said, you know, when my father was dying, every day I went into the office and cried by myself. It did not hinder our business at all. We did not lose a single client. We got every single client that we had a meeting with. Absolutely true. And I share that with you because I think that there's an opportunity to, it was not a counseling or therapy session. It was a statement of fact of where I was in life. It didn't stop me from being a competent person. It didn't stop me from operating at the highest level. It was just something that was true. And sharing that story cracked people open and made them more vulnerable and made us bond in a much faster way. It wasn't why I did it. I did it because practically I had to, but I share that with you because I think it's important to bring your whole self every time. Holly, I'll let you take this next one.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. So who knows who is on this slide? Who recognizes the black turtleneck and the unblinking stare? Third in the chat if you do. This is Elizabeth Holmes, who was the CEO of Theranos, and Elizabeth Holmes is currently on trial for fraud in the Northern District of California. Why did we include her in our presentation? Well, I'll tell you. She is a stunning example of how storytelling and narrative can be used even when you don't have a viable product, right? Theranos, which for those of you who are unfamiliar, claimed that it would revolutionize testing for disease by using just a pinprick of blood instead of a venous straw. That was the premise behind the company. And ultimately, we know now that there was never really any viable technology that Theranos had developed to do that. And if you haven't, I highly encourage you to read the book Bad Blood by Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou, who did phenomenal reporting for years about Theranos, and ultimately that reporting sort of led to the company's undoing. Elizabeth Holmes had just a couple of stories that she told all the time. And it didn't matter if she was in a group of investors with her board of directors, which by the way, included people like General Mattis. She had one of the most highly decorated corporate boards of all time, and one of the most highly valued companies of all time. It didn't matter what audience she was in. She told the same few stories over and over. She beat them like a drum. She stuck the landing like a gymnast. And that narrative, that the promise of what she was building is what sustained that company for as long as it was around. Now, we are certainly not advocating for puffery, right? For anything that's not steeped in truth. We bring up Elizabeth Holmes because we want you to be interrogators of story as well. We want you to understand that that's how powerful storytelling is. It can be used to sustain a company and build it to its apex, to the most highest valuation of all time in American business, based on the power of that narrative. And we have a ton of content about Elizabeth Holmes on our YouTube channel. We love to talk about it because she's back in the news, and she's now sort of flipped her narrative in the course of her trial. But it is just a really interesting topical example of how narrative can be used when a company is both being built and sustained. Do you have anything to add to that, Anne-Marie?
No, I don't. We have a question about how do you know if you're a good storyteller and how do you start? I love
this question.
I do too. This is a superb question. Thank you for asking it. The first thing I want to tell you is every single one of you are a natural storyteller. I want you to think about your last vacation, which might have been a very long time ago as it happens. You do not say, we went to China. We went to San Francisco International Airport and left Terminal 2, Gate 82B. That's not how you tell the story of your vacation. If you do, it's super weird, right? You don't do that. You talk about moments. You talk about scenes. You talk about people. You talk about experiences. You already communicate in this way. The truth of the matter is, when you come home and you talk to your family about the day you had at work, your partner, your children, your friend, you are doing that in a narrative structure. So I want to first say to all of you, you're already natural born storytellers. What we want you to do is be conscious storytellers and think about it. We have some work that we're going to send to you, but we also want to remind you to think about the kinds of stories you need. We referenced this before. I encourage you, if you don't, grab a pen right now. You must have an origin story. How did you begin? How did your business begin? What happened? I started my first business in the midst of a recession because I lost my job, and it was easier to start a business than to actually get a job. I had no experience as an entrepreneur, and I came from a culture of poverty. But what I did know is the first thing I needed to do is get somebody to pay me. Yes. That is my origin story for my first business. You need your origin story. You need a client story, a client that you helped. You need a transformation story, something you've overcome. Those are your stories. You just need to tap into those and share those experiences and those moments. I would just tell you very, very quickly, I remember somebody connected me to somebody who was in business development, and that's what I was doing at the time. And we went to the La Jolla Tennis Club, and he was this much older gentleman, and he was kind of terrible to me. He basically sat back in his chair and sort of said, "Why would anybody hire you? And, why would like, what's your deal? And why would anybody hire you? And why would anybody ever write you a check?" And I thanked him for his time, and I left, and I drove myself home and thought, he was not kind, and he was not generous, and he was also right. And I had to figure out how to shape that story. I had to figure out how to explain that in a narrative form. So I can't say enough about why you need to sort of be able to sit inside of your story. Look at storytellers like Elizabeth Holmes. She used storytelling for nefarious purposes. There are no question about that. What she is a case study in is how powerful it actually is. That's what you should take away from that. You also don't have to be somebody who's an extrovert. If you're not an extrovert, that doesn't matter. That has nothing to do with powerful storytelling. I encourage you to watch Brian Stevenson's TED Talk. He also wrote a gorgeous book called Just Mercy. He is not an extrovert in any way, shape, or form. He is making a profoundly compelling argument, and he uses narrative constantly. Holly,
there's a great question that came in, Anne-Marie. What about a personal situation that truly helped propel me forward, but I am not necessarily ready to share with the world, which I think is an excellent and nuanced question. What are your thoughts?
You should never tell a story you're not ready to tell. Yeah. I think that you have to have worked it out, and you have to be comfortable sharing whatever that is. I also want you to know, and this is a great time to move to the next slide, that your story has the power to save someone. And we believe very much in narrative vulnerability. I share my mistakes all of the time. I think those are some of the richest stories I tell. If the only stories you're telling is about how shiny you are and how you've done everything right, it's not very interesting, and it's not very relatable. It's where your struggle is that makes you interesting. That's what we want to know. This is not a CV. This is not a resume. This is your journey. It's how did you get here? So direct experience is always the highest level of vulnerability. A witness to experience can be good, but make sure it's emotionally honest. Be present. I think if you're not ready, it's important that you hold back and until you are ready. Yeah. And there's no point telling a story that you don't feel, that while you may feel is useful. Listen, we have a lot of clients who they're either executives or they're in very powerful positions, and they have a lot of fear and anxiety that if they tell this story that somehow it will compromise them. That has never happened. It has always, every single time, made them more accessible, more lovable, more relatable, and able to connect more deeply with people every single time. But you have to do the necessary internal work to feel that you can actually do that. It's not something that you should force yourself to do until you're ready.
I totally agree.
Yeah. Any other questions, or should we move to the next slide?
I think we're ready to go to the next.
Okay, great. So I want to talk about, again, specific stories and what you need to do and making this actionable. If you care about this and you want to be able to do this, then here are the ways in which you need to break this down. When it comes to business development and revenue generation, storytelling should be at the heartbeat of all of your business development. What do I mean by that? If you're going to meetings and you have no story to tell, I ask you, what are you doing? Because you're not going to convert those meetings. You're going to go to 1,000 coffees and 1,000 phone calls that go nowhere because you didn't ask critical questions, you had no actionable follow-up, and you had no powerful story to tell or share. So when I say revenue, what I mean is this. You need to be able to tell the story about a client that you transformed and changed in that meeting, in a presentation, at a conference, in a networking event. If all you're doing is telling people what you do, then your sales cycle is long and hard, my friend. It's long and hard.
If I could interrupt, Anne-Marie, a question that may come up is, well, what if I'm early stage and I haven't had a client like that yet, all right? I would encourage all of you to think about what is the human impact of what you're trying to do. And for example, we're working with a startup that's in the medical device space. And so far, there's no patient impact. So the questions that I'm constantly asking is, okay, what's the impact for surgeons? What's the impact for hospital administrators? What's the impact? Who are the humans and how are they transformed? What is the feedback you are getting? What is it, right? So I think this also kind of gets into the vision for the future story, which I know we'll touch upon. But in the event that that question is on any of your minds, I want you to continually ask yourself, what is the human impact? Where are the people, more simply?
Yeah, it should always be people driven. Who does this impact? Who does this change? Who does this transform? Those are really the questions you need to be answering. When it comes to funding and investors, anytime we review a pitch deck from anyone, we are looking for the story. And by the way, we deal with a whole lot of engineers and a whole lot of tech companies and a whole lot of accounting and financial companies. And let me explain something to you. Data are actually stories. That's what it is. It tells the story of something. I had a client many years ago named Michael, and he was a forensic accountant, something I know absolutely zero about. Zero information about. He was doing presentations all over the country, and he had a 0% conversion rate. And by the way, if you're doing speaking engagements, but you're not getting clients, then there's a problem. And you're not converting them. And you're probably not converting them because you don't have a powerful story and you don't understand how to structure the presentation. People might like you. You might think you did a great job, but the goal of that is to get a client. And if you're not getting a client, then it is falling short. So he called me, he sent me his deck, I reviewed it, and there were so many graphs. It was just graph after graph after graph after graph. And the first question I asked him is, who are you presenting this information to? And he said, attorneys, which, by the way, I work with many. And I said, human attorneys? And he said, yeah, they're all human. And I said, do they talk to you after this? And he said, no one talks to me. I said, have you gotten any clients? And he said, no, I haven't gotten any clients. By the way, very expensive. This guy's traveling all over the country pitching this, spending a lot of money. His firm is spending a lot of money and he's not making any money. I looked through the deck and I said, so Michael, on slide 7, did this happen to people? And he said, yeah, oh yeah. A brother and a sister owned this company, and somebody was embezzling, and he goes through this, I mean, extraordinary story, high stakes story. And I said, that's the story you're going to tell. And all we did is we went through about what stories he was going to tell at what slides and how he was going to end. And in a couple of months, he was at a 38% conversion rate from zero. What changed? The content didn't change. It was the way we fashioned the delivery. That's the single thing that changed. So this is also true of end users and your customers. You have to be telling stories all of the time. You do have them. You have to access them. And when people say, I have no stories, we highly recommend using prompts. So we mentioned this before, your origin story, a client story. Think of a difficult client. Think of something you have overcome. Think of a problem you have solved. All of those are stories. You should be able to tell a story about every single one of those. It's that simple. And it's not, you don't have to think about, the pieces and the elements, that we're going to go through that to make sure they're there. If I asked you, tell me about a difficult client, you could tell me that story. You should be able to do this with ease. It should feel very natural to you. If you look at TED Talks, there's a rule in TED. I've coached TED Talks, I've done one, and it's thou shalt tell a story. You aren't allowed, when you do a TED Talk, to merely report information, because they know that their job, their whole mission is ideas worth spreading, and nothing moves and nothing is shared if there is no narrative behind it. If it's just a fact, if it's just information, nobody's going to share it. They need a compelling story. So every really good TED Talk has a story at its heart. Holly,
we can move to the next slide, but from a perspective of just how you, I'm sorry, you, Anne-Marie. Okay, thank you. Just from a perspective of how you can actually do this in real time, I highly recommend having a buddy, whether that's your business partner, or it could be your spouse or your partner or your kid, somebody that you, once you've identified these stories, that you actually run them with. Because I will tell you that I've never told a story in a training that I haven't first told Anne-Marie and sort of vetted it out. And you may say, well, that doesn't feel very spontaneous. That feels kind of rehearsed. Yes, and there's a point to that, because I want the story to land. And that's particularly true, if you're telling particularly pieces of your origin story, I think sometimes can be quite emotional. And if it's involving, parents or a loved one or a family member who inspired you, or a teacher who inspired you, any of those kinds of things. If you're telling a story for the first time in a high stakes conversation, it can run away with you very quickly. So I highly recommend, maybe it's someone who's in a cohort with you, maybe it's someone here, but having that sort of, it's almost just like a real-time editor. I cannot say enough about that.
So these are the elements of story, and this looks sort of like, what? It's not that hard. I'm going to walk through it. I just told the story of Michael in New York. Michael was the character. New York was the setting, if you'd like. The conflict was he was delivering this story all over the country, and he had a conversion rate of 0. That's the conflict. Small conflict, right? This isn't Hamlet. This is not to be or not to be. Very simple. There's a beginning and middle and end. I meet Michael. I look at his work, we solve the problem, and the resolution, that bottom piece, the resolution is he then has a 38% conversion rate. What is the theme of that? The theme of that is information doesn't actually move people, but storytelling does. There were some details in that. I talked about his deck being very graph heavy. I talked about who his audience was. All of those elements were hitting that. Now, here's what I want to ask you. When would I use that story? I've just used it now. Tell me when or why I would use that story. Any thoughts? And by the way, somebody just said, Cynthia just said, do you have any tips for not rambling? Yes, I just did one, the story of Michael. That story, by the way, takes less than 2 minutes. It's really tight. It has every one of the elements. If you don't want to ramble, make sure that you have all the elements and you hit all of those points, that you edit. You're not talking about, I didn't tell you that Michael is bald. You know why? It doesn't matter. He is bald, by the way. It doesn't matter. So just use what's really critical to the story, and that will keep you from sort of veering off. So
this is the Financial Times editorial board had this great quote, for folks that wanted to submit an op-ed, and it was something along the lines of be a miniaturist, not a landscape painter. Yes. And I think that applies, to really tightening up your stories. You want to use detail, right? I mean, Anne-Marie mentioned what Michael did, specific details around his conversion rate, but she didn't start talking about the fact that he had 2 kids at home and his partner did this and that, and he had been working at this firm for 10 years. That's all. She would have lost you, right? We all have someone in our life that rambles, by the way. And so, and sometimes that person is me. So I have lots of compassion for this question, Cynthia. But, really ask yourself, what are the vital details? What details show the most instead of just telling? And what details can be dropped? And again, having a partner that you workshop this kind of thing with can kind of help you. Anne-Marie's done that to me before, like, whoa, I don't know why you're going off on that tangent. That doesn't have anything to do with the conflict and the resolution, which is the heartbeat of the story.
By the way, I'm going to tell you that story, why it's important. I just told you that he was at a 0% conversion rate, and after working with me, he was at 38% conversion rate. That's a business development story. It's a story you integrate into presentations. It's a story you integrate when you're talking to people. Instead of saying, we help people build presentations with higher conversion rates. Who cares? You care about Michael. You relate to Michael. How many presentations have you all been in when they ask at the end, does anybody have any questions? And the air goes out of the room because they lose control. They turn all the power over to the audience. It's not how to end a presentation. That's how Michael was ending his presentations before he started working with me. That story is tight. It's less than 2 minutes. It's powerful. It tells people the value of the work I do without telling them precisely what I do. And again, it's a moment. Getting back to Holly's exquisite example of be a miniaturist. I talk about this just one conversation with Michael. That's it. I don't go into our entire history. I don't tell you that I've worked with his firm for 10 years, because why do you care? You don't care. It doesn't matter. None of that matters. What matters is the work I did with Michael alone and that conversation. That's it. That's all that matters. Let's move to the next slide, please. Holly referenced the show Don't Tell a moment ago, and I did as well. The difference is I could tell you what I could do. I could tell you that we help people deliver presentations to make them to raise more money, increase revenue. I could tell you all that. I could also tell you that storytelling is my life's work and I'm deeply passionate about it. Who cares? Who cares? Who cares? Or I can tell you the story of Michael and show you the power of our work. That's the difference. I can tell you the story of Lydia, who is an environmental attorney who was delivering CLE workshops on CERCLA, something, again, I understood nothing about, who came and brought her presentation to me, and I said, we got to rework the whole thing. All you're doing is telling and telling and telling. And I need you to show people by tapping into the story. Where did this law come from? How did this happen? And what I can tell you about that is that was the starting point for her getting an enormous amount of client work that previously she was not able to procure because just reporting the information was not enough. She is brilliant. She went to Yale. She worked for a top law firm. None of that is enough. What is enough is how she crafted that message and the way in which she communicated and made contact with her audience. That's what we were trying to tap into. That's what actually mattered. Let's move to the next slide, please. I want to talk just for a minute about this idea of business development. Some of you may be here for that. Some of you may not. This is the heartbeat of every business. If you can't raise money, if you can't get people to write you a check, you have no business. That's just the bottom line. I used to say this all the time when I did business development. Business sales and business development is the only money-making activity in a business. That's it. Everything else is an expense. You're a computer, you're hiring, everything. The only thing that actually generates revenue is business development and sales. That's it. And yet we spend the least amount of money, time, and consideration on it. I encourage you to think of yourself as an advocate, expert, and ally, and not somebody trying to convince or coerce somebody to buy something from you. When you go in with the idea that you're trying to solve a problem, you're trying to help someone, you're on the same side of the table, it radically transforms the way that relationship unfolds. We do a whole lot of business negotiation on many, many levels. And I will tell you, I think that there is an old kind of paradigm that you go in with sword clanking and you do this kind of puff out your chest and you throw down sort of, you pound your fist on. That doesn't work as well anymore. But what does work is figuring out where we can align, where we can meet, how I can serve you. I hope that every single one of you believe that people are better for having written you a check. I know that. I never say that to a client, but I know without a question that everyone is better for having written me a check. You should know that too. Don't go to a client like Oliver with your bowl begging. Go with the idea that you have a problem and I am here to help you solve that problem. That is my job. Tell me more. Let me figure out how we can do this together. If you're on this call and you love what you do, but you hate business development, I can't say enough about this. Clicking your lens about the approach will make it much more palatable to you. It's not about getting, it's not about quotas and getting people to write you a check. It's about helping to serve people. That will radically change the way you feel about it. It doesn't feel as dirty. It doesn't feel as sort of manipulative. It feels honest and authentic, and it should be. I mean, you have built a business not because you had nothing to do on a Friday, but because you believe deeply in whatever the work is that you're doing. We want to make that job easier for you and make that trajectory much smoother. You are going to do that if you get better at harnessing your own story. Holly, anything else to add to that?
Yeah, we can move on.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. So we want to talk about sourcing your stories again. We've talked about structure. We've talked about the kinds of stories you need. Hopefully you've been taking lots and lots of notes. We highly recommend you go to our YouTube channel, which is Story Imprinting. We constantly talk about structure. We talk about accessing your story. Here are just ways in. Every Monday, I put up a story prompt. A story prompt might be your first job. That's a great story. Your best boss, your worst boss, your best client, your worst client, your biggest mistake. Those are all great prompts. Now, when you get a prompt like that, what do? You should write for 15 minutes without stopping. Don't edit, don't think about it. Just see what rises up to meet you. That's your goal. Inside of that is a heartbeat of an important story you can use in some way, shape, or form. Get really good at accessing these stories and memorialize them. That doesn't mean you have to write every single one down. I bullet point a lot of stories. I'm going to tell a story before we leave, and Holly refers to that story as Guy on the Airplane. I mean, that's what she referred, and we both know what that means. That's all I need to be able to do that. Think about stories where you influenced an outcome. That's really important to sourcing your story. An audience. Why are you telling this story? If you have, when I talk to Uber or Google or, Dropbox, I'm not telling them about a small client I have. And when we have a smaller client who's making well under $1 million, we for sure aren't telling them about Uber as our client. Why? Because that doesn't match who they are. And that's out of sync with what they care about. It's not audience centric. And think about situational stories. circumstances that you're in. Again, when you have overcome something, when something has been really hard, when you maybe had a failure, when maybe you turned something around with a client that started out hard, but then you turned it around. Those are your best stories. This is how you source stories. Again, we're going to send you something that's going to help you do that. You can access for free tons of content on our YouTube channel we're constantly producing, which will help you sort of learn how to do this in a quick and easy digestible way with a low level of time, if you will. Holly, do you want to add anything else about sort of the homework or questions before we start to take any last minute questions and kind of wind down?
Sure. So Leah, our handle on YouTube and everywhere is @StoryImprinting. And so we invite you to check out all of our content on the channel. And we also create these videos in direct response to what our audience wants. So if you're here today and you're like, I would like a video about stories about influencing outcomes, let us know. We want to know. We will do a video about it for you. So here's all of our handles as well. And now is the time, if you have questions about any of this before we close with the story, because we want you to see how this is done in a presentation context. Now is the time to ask your questions. On the story prompt download that flashed on the screen earlier, which will be sent to you again, I believe, it is a list of a lot of prompts. So do not get overwhelmed by it. Just go through and see, okay, which of these speaks to me? Which of these is easiest? Maybe it's a person who changed you, a person who influenced you. You know, the person that influenced me to do the work I do is my mom, who got married at 15 and finished high school at 34 and sold commission-only cemetery property and funeral pre-arrangement for a living, right? And used to take me on every sales call, because this was back in the day, you know, when you could do that, and I'd just sit in the car. Or I'd go inside with her and I'd listen. That is a person who influenced me. And I will tell you that I have done this work. I know that we do it, you know, together. Don't edit yourself. As Anne Marie said, I sat down when we started our company and I just wrote for about half an hour about how growing up with a mother like that helped me become a better business developer and helped me become a more empathetic listener to other people's stories and made me good at what I do. So maybe that's the one that speaks to you, but just pick one and start there. There are a lot of prompts. Do not get overwhelmed by any of them. Just pick one that resonates. I just want to check
I don't think we have any questions. And
okay.
So I want to leave you today with a story, and I share this because this happened to me many years ago. Most of my career has been on the road prior to the pandemic. I spent a lot of time in airports and hotels and convention centers, speaking and training. And I tell this story for a number of reasons. No matter who you are on this call, there's some portion of you who feel maybe that you aren't as powerful or don't have as much of an impact. And so I always want to share this story about what I think leadership can be and the way that we can have an impact on one another. I was on a plane. It was about a 5-hour flight, and there was a woman at the very, very back of the plane. I was close to the back of the plane with a new, not quite newborn, probably of about 15 months. And the baby was screaming from the time she got on the plane and throughout the flight. It never, ever, ever relented. For those of you who don't have children, what I want you to know is when you have a child, you don't want them to scream either. Nobody wants that. Every parent is doing whatever they can to try to make sure their child is comforted. And it's clear if you are a parent that kind of screaming is a child in distress. But what happened on that flight was people were nasty. People weren't compassionate or kind. I could hear people saying terrible things like, when is she going to shut that baby up? And somebody should buy that baby a drink and knock it out. And so this poor young mother who had this screaming child who she could not comfort also had the energy of the hostility directed towards her of these passengers for 5 solid hours with no break. Now, if you're a parent and you've had a crying baby, you know in your body and your bones what that feels like. So as we were landing, the screaming increased. It got more intense. And when the wheels finally hit the ground, our flight attendant got on the PA system and said, "I would like to ask everybody to please remain on your seat, in your seats, and let this young mother off the plane. She has a child in distress, and we would like to give her the opportunity to get off first." And people still weren't kind. People were saying things like, "Yeah, let her off. We should have let her off an hour ago." And I turn and I watch this young mother whose neck is totally red and whose baby is arching its back in distress, screaming. And I see her crying, and her diaper bag is hitting every seat as she's trying to get down the aisle. And I look at her and I just well up with empathy and compassion. And I see just ahead of me, probably 3 or 4 rows ahead, this old man. And he's super tiny. It's like his suit is wearing him. You all know that kind of stage in life where people start getting smaller physically. It's also important that in our culture, we don't really necessarily value older people. They become invisible very often. And we don't see them as having much power. But he did this most remarkable, small, compassionate thing. He placed his hand on this woman's back as she was walking by, and he said, "Good job, Mama. Good job. You're doing a good job." And he didn't stop there. As she kept walking, he started clapping really loudly, and he yelled, "Good job, Mama. Good job." And every single person on that plane stood up and started clapping and said, "Good job, Mama. Good job." This little tiny man who had no power or influence turned around the attitude of an entire plane, and he saved that woman. He gave her grace, and he gave her compassion, and he made us all better people. You too have that power, and I hope you will exert it. I hope you will remember that man on the plane, because I have carried him in my back pocket for over a decade. And I often end presentations with him because I think we all could be kinder and gentler and change the world a little bit. When you leave this planet, the stories about you are all that remain. I don't know that man's name, but I do know his story. Thank you very much for having us.
Wow, wow, and wow. Like if we were all in a room, we'd hear the standing ovation right now. So that was absolutely marvelous. Thank you, Anne-Marie and Holly. What a fantastic story to close with, message to close with, but also the entire content that was shared along the way. We are really grateful. The chat and the participants were extremely engaged. I hear they want to practice right now. You really did provide content that can be applied and content that can really be transformative in the way they speak their message to their clients, to their prospects, to their employees, etc. So again, thank you very much. If you are still logged in, please share your appreciation in the chat now with Holly and Anne-Marie. You do have their contact information and their social channels, so I encourage you to follow them, to stay connected, to continuously extract their resources that they are providing and leverage them in your own work. There was a couple questions earlier if this would be recorded and shared. Absolutely, we will be sharing this with all the registrants. We will also be sharing a one-pager that they provided that will have different prompts, questions that will get you thinking. What are my stories? How do I collect these moments, these micro moments, so that I can turn them into really powerful, engaging stories? So we will share that with you. From a very personal perspective, I also find that having a method to collect and aggregate your stories is helpful and valuable. You might experience something today that you can leverage 2 weeks from today. So having that place where you can bank your stories, where you can collect them, and then you can later repurpose and recycle them. So that would just be my little tip. Excuse me. All right, well, this is definitely a wonderful way to close session 5 of our 6-part series. Again, thank you, Anne-Marie and Holly and Story Imprinting for fabulous contribution. To all of you, I say thank you for joining. There is one more session coming up, so you don't want to miss that. Be sure to follow us on our social media channels, read our emails so that you can stay abreast of the latest programming that we have available. Additionally, this content should be shared. Don't let this great information stay and end with you. Share it out with your network. Share it out with other business owners that you know can benefit from it. If you are a business owner that has not yet participated in the Stanford Scaling Program, there are a few more days to participate and submit your application. You can check us out on our website and submit your application on our website. That's www.lban.us. We would encourage you to apply, learn more about what we do. And then, of course, we do have, I know that, Leah, you mentioned in the chat, is there an opportunity for you to practice? This platform, Socio, has a breakout room and networking room. So if you have time, click in there, see who else you can connect with. It will be a fantastic moment for you to apply exactly what you're learning. So again, with that, we will sign off. I actually want to just say one more thing. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Story Imprinting. Thank you. I also want to recognize the LBAN team because there's so many people working behind the scenes that makes this possible. So Arturo, Alien, Diego, thank you all for your contributions. And of course, I want to thank our supporters, Bank of America, Raquel, and the entire Bank of America team. And with that, we will sign off, say happy Hispanic Heritage Month. Have a great rest of the afternoon and a wonderful weekend. We'll see you, everyone.
Bye all.